we would certainly, as a world, be better off if we had, say, half as many people.
It's simplistic to say that X number of people is too much for the planet. Historically, it's quite clear that what X is has changed over time.
We see life support systems breaking down, even with 5 billion people.
There is no physical limit in the long run on the number of people that this planet can support.
Our impact on the Earth depends on two things: how much we individually consume and how many consumers there are.
We are now consuming the Earth's resources faster than ever before.
Due to advances in modern medicine and the associated extended life expectancy, the world population has been growing substantially. As of this moment, there are 7.2 billion souls on Earth, adding 200,000 to it every day. Scientists believe that in 2100 we will reach the population capacity. 10 billion people will walk the Earth. Not all are as fortunate to live accordingly to the Western standards. The planet can only sustain 4 billion of those rich men. Overpopulation means that the area cannot provide enough resources to the vast number of people in it. To comply to the bare necessities of life, the demand is bigger than what the Earth can provide. If we continue to live the way we do now, natural resources like water, oil and wood will finally run out. The battle for fresh water is already a big issue in Africa. Poor people simply cannot cover the costs of water, and the gap between the rich and downtrodden is getting bigger. This and the fact that people are also forced to live closely to each other, causing friction and irritations, can lead to major social tensions. But these social changes are not the only changes that occur. A strong growth in populace affects the Earth and her inhabitants in various other ways, such as on a physical, geographical, and demographical level. There is a discussion whether the growing population is connected with climate change, and in particular the greenhouse effect, pollution, and the heightened carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere.
We now realize that the disasters that continue increasingly to afflict the natural world have one element that connects them all: the unprecedented increase in the number of human beings on the planet. There have been prophets who've warned us of this impending disaster, of course. One of the first was Thomas Malthus.
During the 20th century, environmentalists used Malthus' argument to stress that the Earth cannot sustain too many people and that resources will run out unless population growth is brought under control. Famous examples are the Population Bomb, written by Paul Ehrlich, and the report for the Club of Rome, Limits to Growth. Both works predicted disaster for humanity due to rapid population growth outstripping resource supply. Ehrlich made a grim prediction that in the 1970s and 80s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash program embarked upon now. Both books urged that radical action was needed to limit overpopulation. Limits to Growth and the Population Bomb rekindled Malthus' theory in the 20th century, and a debate whether Malthus was right or wrong.
The fundamental truth that Malthus proclaimed remains the truth. There cannot be more people on this earth than can be fed. Many people would like to deny that this is so. They would like to believe in that oxymoron, sustainable growth. Kenneth Boulding, President Kennedy's environmental advisor 45 years ago, said something about this. Anyone who believes in indefinite growth in anything physical on a physically finite planet, he said, is either mad or an economist.
The world is not sustainable at the present population. We have too many people.
We're already way, way above what the planet can sustain in the long term.
The whole reason that consumption has become an issue is because there are so many of us that there is not enough to share for all.
The most recent calculations are that a sustainable population which gave people a maximum number of options would be about 2 billion or 1.5 billion people.
So the key is to bring population to a stable level.
If you manage somehow to half each person's consumption on average, but you allow population size to double, you haven't gained at all. Because if you have half as much consumption per person, but twice as many persons, you're right where you started from.
Another solution would be to stop vaccinating. People will be more susceptible to diseases, and epidemics will cause a natural outflow of our species. This idea is plausible, yet revolting.
If you're going to talk about a sustainable society, you then have to let the population decline.
Gradual population decline is exactly what we want.
And the sooner we move in that direction, the more likely we are to avoid a really catastrophic problem for humanity.
Also advocated actively contributing to the deaths of more of the poor through social engineering. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. In our towns, we should make the streets narrower, crowd more people into the houses, and court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools and particularly encourage settlement in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate scientific remedies for ravaging diseases and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken men who have thought that they are doing a service to mankind by protecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. The horrific nature of this idea is made all the more preposterous by the fact that Malthus was encouraging the spread of disease and plague in order to save humanity from the diseases and plagues that overpopulation fosters.
I suspect that you could read a score of reports by bodies concerned with global problems and see that population is clearly one of the drivers that underlies them all, and yet find no reference to this obvious fact in any of them. A recent report by a Royal Commission on the environmental impact of demographic change in this country, which denied that population size was a problem at all, as though 20 million extra people, more or less, would have no real impact. Of course, it's not our only or even our main environmental problem, but it's absurd to deny that, as a multiplier of all the others, it is a problem. Climate change tops the environmental agenda at present. We all know that every additional person will need to use some carbon energy, if only for firewood for cooking, and will therefore create more carbon dioxide, though of course a rich person will produce vastly more than a poor one.
Up till the present day, it seems that history proved Ehrlich and other doomsayers wrong, since the mass starvations predicted for the latter quarter of the 20th century never occurred.
Population continues to get the blame. The outstanding example of this is the curious case of the expanding Sahara Desert.
Satellite images have shown that the Sahara Desert has expanded in recent years. When people look at this, they have often blamed the expansion of the desert on pressure of grazing animals, which they say is brought about by increases in population in the countries of the Sahel and the need of these people to have more cattle grazing more intensively on the edges of the desert. However, satellite images also show in some years that the desert contracts. When people see these images, they say, that is the climate change. There's a favorable climate in these 2 years, and so the desert has contracted. However, if you're going to use climate change to explain the contraction of the desert, then you must also allow for climate change to explain some of the expansion of the desert that occurs in other years.
It took hundreds of thousands of years for the world population to hit 1 billion. In comparison, it took only 123 more years to reach 2 billion, and merely 33 years to hit 3 billion.
Very roughly 250,000 years to reach 1 billion in 1800. More than a century passed before it reached 2 billion. The billion after that took less than a third of the time. The one after that took only half as long, and the following stages to 5 billion and 6 billion took 13 and 12 years. and the population seems to be rising as fast as ever. The most recent billion, again, took only a dozen years.
Currently, the world population increases by 1 billion people every 13 years. Every second, an average of 4.2 people are born and 1.8 people die. That's a net gain of 2.4 people per second. By 2025, it is estimated to reach 8 billion. By 2050, there will be 2.5 billion more people on Earth than there are today. That's an increase equal to the entire world population in 1950.
These bacteria live in a bottle. Their population doubles every minute. At 11 a.m., there is one bacterium. At 12 noon, the bottle is full. It is half full at 11:59, leaving only enough space for one more doubling. The bacteria see the danger. They search for new bottles and find 3. They assume that their problem is solved. By 12 noon, the first bottle is full. By 12:01, the second bottle is full. By 12:02, all the bottles are full. This is the problem that we face due to the doubling caused by exponential growth.
But is the planet's population growth really exponential?
So will our numbers keep rising? Almost certainly yes, for several decades. More people are in their reproductive years than ever before. More children survive thanks to better healthcare and sanitation, and people are living longer. The UN's best estimate is there will be 8 billion people by 2025, 9 billion by 2050, and 10 billion by the end of the century. A higher UN prediction has the population at nearly 16 billion by 2100. Much of the increase will be driven by poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa, many already with inadequate food and water. In the next 40 years, Ethiopia could see its population rise from around 80 million to 145 million. Contrast that with Germany, a similar population to Ethiopia now, but this could fall to 75 million by 2050. Indeed, there is a scenario that sees the world's population falling. The UN's lower estimate for 2100 is just over 6 billion people, 1 billion fewer than there are now. Why?
The era of acceleration is over, and this is just as important to understand as the continued rise in the population. The population has gone on rising because of what happened in the 50s and 60s. This was the period of the baby boom in rich countries and very high birth rates in poor ones. But momentum is shifting. The additional numbers added each year to the total are now dropping. This is because the total fertility rate, that's the number of children a woman can expect to have during her lifetime, has been falling for a long time. That means families are getting smaller, and the underlying impetus towards population growth has dropped. In some countries, the speed of change has been breathtaking. In Iran, fertility fell from 7 to below 2. Sometime in the next few years, the world will reach another milestone. Half of mankind will be living in countries or regions where fertility is at or below 2.1. That is the replacement rate, at which a country is having only enough children to keep the population stable.
Well, global fertility is already falling. In 1950, women on average had 5 children each. It's now down to 2.5. Small variations in fertility could have a big effect on population size in the future. In much of the world, including Brazil, Europe, Russia, Japan, even China, fertility has fallen so much that populations are reliably predicted to fall later this century.
And it looks as if by about 2060 or thereabouts, global population is going to peak, then plateau, then go into decline. Now, there's no such projection for consumption. There is no such projection for economic growth. There is no such projection for any of the other issues which are hammering the world's life support systems.
Birth rates drop in the course of social and economic development very regularly. There's really no country which has not had a sharp fall in fertility as a result of wide-scale social and economic development.
Lack of space shouldn't be a problem. If everyone lived in one megacity, the density of Paris, then in theory, the entire population of the planet could fit into France with room to spare.
There are a lot of terms that are used in the population debate, such as population spiraling out of control, or unfettered population growth, or exponential population growth, which are basically terms designed to elicit alarm.
Population pyramids tell us far more about a country than just a set of numbers, by showing both where it's been and where it's headed within a single image. Here, the data is divided by gender, with females on one side and males on the other. The population numbers are shown for each 5-year age interval, starting from 0 to 4 and continuing up to 100 and up. These intervals are grouped together into pre-reproductive, 0 to 14, reproductive, 15 to 44, and post-reproductive years, 45 and up. Such a population pyramid can be a powerful predictor of future population trends. For example, Rwanda's population pyramid shows it to be a fast-growing country. With most of the population being in the youngest age groups at the bottom of the pyramid, the number will grow rapidly in the coming years. As today's children reach their reproductive years and have children of their own, the total population is almost certain to double within the next few decades. For our second example, let's look at Canada, where most of the population is clustered around the middle of the graph. Because there are less people in the pre-reproductive age groups than there are in the reproductive ones, the population will grow more slowly as the number of people reaching their reproductive years decreases. Finally, let's look at Japan. Because the majority of its population is in its post-reproductive years, and the number of people is smaller at each younger interval, this means that at current rates of reproduction, the population will begin to decline as fewer and fewer people reach reproductive age.
Japan has one of the longest life expectancies in the world. According to the World Health Organization, Japanese men have a life expectancy of 82 years, which is tied at 5th, and women have the longest in the world at 87 years old. In fact, in March 2014, a Japanese woman just had her 116th birthday and became the oldest living person in the world. Yay! Japan is roughly the size of California, but when we compare it to the US, Japan has a population that is roughly 1/3 of America. So that's 127 million people, all living on an island that is just 4% of the size of the United States. The population density of Japan is focused around major metropolitan areas, the biggest two being Tokyo and Osaka. If we compare the density of Japan and the US, you will see something shocking. The US has roughly 1 person per 2 football fields. Japan's average density is 11 people. Tokyo, one of the largest cities in the world, holds an astonishing 192 people in the same space. As time goes on, the rural areas of Japan are projected to slowly lose more and more people, and by 2060, much of the countryside will only have ghost towns. According to a government report, Japan's current population of 127 million will go down to 106 million by 2040, and it will decline to 86 million by 2060. That's 30% decrease from 2010. In addition, By the time Japan reaches 2060, the largest demographic will become 86-year-olds. That's 4 out of 10 people who will be over the age of 65.
Comparing these 3 population pyramids side by side shows us 3 different stages in the demographic transition as a country moves from a pre-industrial society to one with an industrial or post-industrial economy. Countries that have only recently begun the process of industrialization typically see an increase in life expectancy and a fall in child mortality rates as a result of improvements in medicine, sanitation, and food supply, while birth rates remain constant, leading to a population boom. Developing countries that are farther along in the industrialization process begin to see a fall in birth rates due to factors such as increased education and opportunities for women outside of childrearing, and a move from rural to urban living that makes having large families less economically advantageous. Finally, countries in advanced stages of industrialization reach a point where both birth and death rates are low, and the population remains stable or even begins to decline. China's population pyramid reflects the establishment of the one-child policy 35 years before, which prevented a population boom but also led to sex-selective abortions, resulting in more male children than female children.
In 1979, China introduced the one-child policy. The purpose of this was to halve the population in 1 generation, but this brings forth another issue. The labor force, the actual number of people available for work, will be too small to support the economy in 2025.
The pyramid for the United States shows the baby boom that followed World War II.
Population growth in the U.S. slowed a bit during the past decade, but don't be fooled. The U.S. is still growing rapidly compared to most countries in the developed world.
Imagine, if you will, the United States population growing every day by an amount large enough to found a small town, about 7,800 people, and then extend that to a full year when the population grows enough to just about fill the city limits of the city of Chicago, 2.8 million people, because that's how fast the United States population grows every year. In fact, you might remember 2006 when the U.S. population topped 300 million. Well, people aren't talking about it much yet, but the end of 2010 marked the point where we'd already grown to 310 million people. And by 2025, we'll hit 350 million people. Now, in contrast to the rapidly growing population in the United States, I want you to stop and imagine for a moment a nation where the population is actually declining. Tax revenues would be suffering. Business revenues would be suffering because there'd be a smaller market to sell to. There'd be very few new houses being built. In fact, there might be very little new construction at all, except for government-sponsored projects that were paid for just to try to keep things going. A shrinking workforce would not be able to meet the demands of an ever-aging population. And the economy would be declining and declining relative to the nations in the rest of the world. And that's exactly the challenge faced in the near future by countries like Japan, Russia, and many of the nations in Europe, where populations will actually be declining. It's because America has a high fertility rate or high birth rate relative to many other well-developed nations. It's a tremendous advantage that gives us a great pull ahead of countries in Europe, Russia, Japan, many nations in Southeast Asia. It's a great advantage. About 50% of all of that population growth is occurring in only a handful of nations, 9 nations to be exact, including the United States, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a few nations in Africa, accounting for 1/2 of all global population growth.
As populations stagnate or even decline in Europe, Japan, and China, Africa's population of 1 billion is expected to more than double by 2050. More people means more consumption, more production, more growth. African economies grew on average around 6% last year. That's 3 times the pace of America's growth and faster than many Asian countries.
Population is only one among many, many factors, and I don't think it's even the most important factor. And if you isolate population, the only thing you're doing is sort of throwing a smokescreen on what is the real problem now, which is overconsumption in developed countries.
Developed countries are leading the way when it comes to food wastage, according to a UK report. The study claims up to half of all the food produced worldwide isn't eaten for reasons including poor harvesting, transport and storage. Consumer behaviour is particularly to blame in the West, with best before and use by dates confusing customers and leading to up to 50% of what's bought in the supermarket ending up in the bin.
The problem of food waste is dominant in Western industrialized countries, because in developing countries where there is generally a much higher level of poverty, people simply can't afford to waste any food.
In developing countries, problems with harvesting and storage still lead to food being thrown away. Worldwide, up to 2 billion tonnes is not eaten every year, says the London-based Institution for Mechanical Engineers.
Here in Britain, we get rid of our own body weight in rubbish every 7 weeks. We throw out 1.5 million computers every year. 99% of them in perfect working order. On average, we buy a new mobile phone every 18 months, leaving 90 million working handsets hoarded in cupboards up and down the country. And 3 million fridges are discarded every year. Every year we buy more products, more things we think we need, using more energy, creating more waste.
One statistic says that in the year 1900, 330,000 tons of waste were produced by urbanites every day, compared with 3.3 million tons of waste created daily in the year 2000. Experts estimate that by the end of the 21st century, that number may triple to 11 million tons of waste being produced every day. Peak waste has already been reached by some of the more developed countries in the world, where there is more awareness of reducing energy consumption and refuse.
And the data's getting more frightening by the day. Across the world, more and more countries are following in our polluted tracks. China's economy has grown at around 10% every year for the last 15 years. The result has been an explosion in consumption. Around 250 million people now enjoy a relatively affluent lifestyle, roughly the same number as the entire population of the United States. Consumerism in the Western world took 2 centuries to develop. In China, it's taking less than a decade. This may be great news for a country emerging from centuries of poverty, but it comes at a serious cost. China is planning to build 10 new airports and roughly 35 new coal-fired power stations every year for the next 5 years. Car sales have also increased dramatically. There are now 1,000 new cars on Beijing's roads every single day. By 2015, there will be more cars in China than in the whole of the United States. So if China ever achieved the same level of car ownership as the United States, with its much bigger population, they would need to import more oil every day than is produced in the entire world every year.
Human beings have used more natural resources since the end of World War II than in all of human history before.
Did you know that it takes an average of 15,000 litres of water to produce just 1 kilo of beef? In 2010, the average American consumed over 100 kilos. This all adds up. 300 litres of water go into producing 1 litre of soft drink. Some supermarket chains even throw away the heels in a bread loaf just because consumers don't like them. Up to 1/3 of this bread will never even reach the shelves, and of the food that does make it to consumers, a further third is wasted. Staggeringly, this waste is nearly equal to the entire food production of sub-Saharan Africa. That's 230 million tonnes.
Today's economy is still scandalously inefficient in its use of energy, water and raw materials. Yet the technologies we need already exist, and with massive new investment they will become both more efficient and cheaper. And that's where we come to the role of government.
There are roughly 22.5 million washing machines in the UK, between them performing about 6 billion washes every year. Now, an inefficient washing machine uses around 100 litres per wash. An efficient one around 45 litres. So simply moving over from inefficient washing machines to efficient washing machines would save more than half of the 585 billion litres of water that we use in the UK every year just to wash our clothes. So shouldn't EU governments get this sorted out? Instead of relying on a few green consumers, why don't they impose minimum efficiency standards that all manufacturers would have to meet?
The richest 1% of Americans make more than a fifth of the country's income and command 40% of its wealth. In 2007, the richest 10% of households captured half of the country's earnings, leaving the other 90% of the country to divvy up the rest.
Our entire economic system is designed for the wealthy. The bottom line here is that material wealth, especially money, does not give you the right to control and use excessive resources.
Principally, we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. The money never actually goes to the country. It goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country that help a few very wealthy people, but don't benefit the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or have cars to drive on the highways, and yet they're left holding a huge debt that they can't repay. So we go back at some point and say, you know, you can't pay your debts. Give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Vote with us on the next critical UN vote. Allow us to build a military base in your backyard. Something along these lines. And when we fail, the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders. And if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then we send in the military. I don't think the failure is capitalism. I think it's a specific kind of capitalism that we've developed. We've created what I consider a mutant, viral form of capitalism. And this mutant form of capitalism, which I think is really a predatory form of capitalism, has created an extremely unstable, unsustainable, unjust, and very, very dangerous world.
Throughout history, it has been assumed that material wealth conferred the rights of possession or control of resources, which has and does at times include human beings. This is largely true today, even if the control appears more subtle at times. Most of the resources on the planet are in the possession of a very small minority of people, mostly Westerners, mostly white, mostly men. Forbes reported 946 billionaires worldwide. Each had an average individual net worth of $3.6 billion. That's $3.5 trillion combined. 12% of the world's population, mostly living in North America and Western Europe, is responsible for 60% of global consumption. This statistic is reflective of the fact that half the world's population exists on less than $2.50 a day.
Regardless of how one feels about the morality of these statistics and the human misery they indicate, it has proven to be a characteristic of an unsustainable global economic system. Many essential global non-renewable resources are at or beyond critical mass. Global climate change is well underway, resulting in effects few can deny and increasing populations experience. Consumption among all socioeconomic classes is increasing, and finally, conflict and social unrest are increasing worldwide.
Even beyond the super wealthy, affluent populations in wealthy countries consume far more than their share. The United States, home to less than 5% of the global population, yearly consumes nearly 25% of the world's fossil fuel resources, 25% of the coal, 26% of the oil, and 27% of the natural gas. Over the last century, raw food material consumption rose 5.1 times more than our population. Total U.S. fuel and material consumption rose 57% from 1970 to 2000, which was 51% higher than the European average. Raw material resource use in the United States increased by more than 1/3 from 1992 to 2001. According to the National Association of Home Builders, the average new home size in the United States rose from 1,400 square feet in 1970 to 2,700 square feet in 2009.
Continued resource consumption and energy use in Western countries are far overreaching our desire for socially desirable goods and services, and the overuse of non-renewable resources is resulting in dramatic environmental impacts, including climate change, pollution, altered biochemical cycles, and reduced biodiversity. The U.S. primary energy consumption increased from 40 quadrillion BTU in 1950 to 100 quadrillion BTU in 2001. In order for us to support the projected 9 billion global population in 2050 at the current U.S. lifestyle standards would require about 268 terawatts, 16 times the current global energy use. As unattainable as this fact sounds, consider that the U.S. consumption levels are increasing yearly, as are the levels of most nations, especially China and India. While there are a good number of non-renewable resources left on the planet, we are consuming them at an almost unimaginable rate, and some that we rely upon heavily are running out. The World Wildlife Fund predicts that at the current rate humans are consuming resources, we will have entirely exhausted many of our essential natural resources by 2050, and for most, we will have no alternatives. Even our renewable resources are no longer replacing themselves to meet increasing demand, and while such resources will never truly disappear, their practical use may be severely restricted by a diminished replacement rate, increased consumption, and growing population.
So are the world's environmental ills really a result of the burgeoning number of humans on the planet, predicted to reach at least 9 billion people by 2050? Or is it more due to the fact that although the human population has doubled in the past 50 years, we have increased our use of resources fourfold?
Yes, there is an issue with population, and it is one of the factors which loads the environment with extra pressure. There's no question about that. But I would challenge the basic formula which was put forward originally by Paul Ehrlich, which is I equals PAT, that the total impact of humanity on the planet equals population times affluence times technology. The research suggests that a far more accurate formulation would be I equals CAT. Total impact equals consumers times affluence times technology. Because the truth is that there are large portions of the world's population who can simply not be classified as consumers. They are just not consuming any significant amount of resources at all. And there was an extraordinary gathering of 5 billionaires in the US 2 years ago, who all considered themselves socially conscious and forward-looking billionaires, and they sat down to decide what was the biggest environmental issue which had to be dealt with. And perhaps unsurprisingly, they chose population. Unsurprising, because it was the only issue for which they weren't responsible. And it's no coincidence that the people you hear most often articulating the need to stop people having babies are post-reproductive white men, because they are least responsible for that problem, even though they might be most responsible for all the problems of consumption. And those 5 billionaires, if there were just 50,000 people living like they do, the impact would be overwhelming. It would be enormous. When you look at the way in which billionaires tend to live, with their yachts which consume in 10 minutes what the average African would use in an entire lifetime in terms of fossil fuel, with their swimming pools heated to 38 degrees all the year round, outdoor swimming pools so that they can lie there under the stars as if they were in the bath, with their fast cars, with their private planes, with all the rest of it, you see that the carrying capacity of the Earth is totally a function of consumption. There is no steady state carrying capacity of the world. You hear the Optimum Population Trust saying the carrying capacity of the world is 2 billion people. You say, well, 2 billion people doing what? 2 billion people living like us would overload the Earth. Living like we do in the UK, whereas 2 billion people living like a rural villager in sub-Saharan Africa would scarcely be felt, especially in terms of resource depletion, because they don't have the financial resources to be using up ecological resources on any great scale.
The myth of overpopulation is great, I think, for the West, because it's so simple. Just tell them to have less children and all the problems will be solved. It's not at all like that. You know, the world's problems won't be solved until we eradicate poverty, until we allow third world countries to trade fairly, and unless we channel more resources to the poor countries, until those countries have, you know, the environmentally sound technologies they need to develop, unless there's much fair distribution of income worldwide.
I think we can all agree there are too many people in the world, and we really should limit our reproduction. But too many people is not the reason that half the population of the world has to live in hunger and squalor, and the rest of us lives of desperation and alienation.
Today's increasingly interconnected world, facing issues such as food shortages, ecological threats, and economic disparities, it is increasingly important for both scientists and policymakers to have a rich and complex understanding of populations and the factors affecting them.
How people perceive the issue of population is critical. It is by these perceptions that international and national legislative policies are formulated and local medical plans and sex education classes are designed. Thus, it is equally critical that people ensure that their perceptions are grounded not in rhetoric and emotions, but in established scientific and empirical data. So what is the real problem? It's not sex, it's money. It's not the poor, it's the rich. So where are the movements protesting about the stinking rich destroying our living systems? Where is the direct action against super yachts and private jets? Where's class war when you need it?